Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. Massive news announced overnight, roughly just 35 minutes shy of the midnight deadline on Wednesday. Knesset opposition leader and Yesh Atid party chair Yair Lapid declaring success in forming a government, or at least he's successful in theory.
אדוני הנשיא, אני מצטער לך להגיד שעלה בידי להקים ממשלה עם סיעות יש עתיד, ימינה, כחול לבן, רע"מ, תקווה חדשה, מרץ ומפלגת העבודה, כולם ביחד, כולם חתמו לי, כולם הודיעו לי שעלה בידי מבחינתם, אז אני מצטער להודיע לך שעלה בידי להקים ממשלה.
Likely out of excitement, leader of the anti-Netanyahu change bloc, Yair Lapid, forgetting to mention the Israel Beitenu party as his eighth and final supporter, in declaring that Israel may soon have a new government. And the proposed Broad Unity Coalition, including an Arab Islamic party for the first time in Israel's history, led by the center-left Lapid and the right-wing nationalist Naftali Bennett from Yamina, with Bennett poised to serve as prime minister for the first half of the 4-year term. Hundreds of Israelis on the streets overnight, likewise celebrating a possible end to the stalled election process.
My fellow protesters and I were in the streets for more than a year, so it's a great celebration. We're hopeful for this change, for a better future for this wonderful state. That's why we're here.
We're celebrating formation of new government. For 2 years, Israel hasn't had any government. We have had several elections that were endless, and now we are hopeful for a new stable government.
The coalition not yet finalized, though. It must still be ratified with a vote of confidence in the Knesset, which President Rivlin and Yair Lapid are urging to be convened as soon as possible. And this request is much easier said than done. Opponents to the listing, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and Knesset Speaker Yariv Levin, who are working hard to delay the vote for as long as possible. The idea being to buy enough time to sway members of the change bloc to defect, which may prove successful in the coming days before the vote.
אני מבקש להודות לכל אחת ואחד מחברות וחברי הכנסת על האמון שנתתם בי. אני מקבל עליי את האחריות הכבדה שהטלתם על כתפיי, מקבל את הזכות לשרת את העם כולו בתפקיד רם ונישא זה.
With an overwhelming 87 votes out of 120, former Knesset opposition leader and chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, Isaac Bougie Herzog, has been elected the next president of Israel. And Herzog set to be the 11th Israeli president following in his father's footsteps, his 7-year term beginning July 9 at the end of his predecessor Reuven Rivlin's tenure. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, meanwhile, among the first after Knesset Speaker Yariv Levin to offer best wishes to his former political opponent.
אני חושב שכולנו מתברכים בבחירה, וכולנו בטוחים גם שיהיה כאן דבר חשוב וטוב למדינת ישראל במסורת של משפחת הרצוג.
תודה רבה.
הרבה ברכות.
תודה רבה, ואני מקווה שאני אוכל לעבוד עם כל ממשלה ועם כל ראש ממשלה.
טוב, בואו לא ניכנס לזה עכשיו.
Herzog, who was at one time former head of the Labour Party during his 15 years in Knesset, is known as a soft-spoken and mild-mannered leader who ran effective but respectful campaigns generally devoid of the typical political infighting. And at the height of his Knesset career, he was considered a prime candidate for challenging Prime Minister Netanyahu. Following his unseating in Labour Party primaries in 2017 and his unanimous appointments to chair the Jewish Agency for Israel in 2018, however, Herzog took a hiatus from politics until now. And indeed, his experience and reputation in politics and afterwards largely to thank for the morning victory, even opponents and critics of Herzog's saying that they would vote for him over his opposition. Speaking of whom, Miriam Peretz, the sole other candidate in the presidential election, receiving just 26 Knesset votes. And if she had won, she'd have become the first elected woman president in the country. Peretz, a social activist and educator born in Morocco, was unfortunately first launched into the public eye after the 1998 and 2010 deaths of her 2 sons in battle. A grief that later inspired a motivational speaking career, however, in the topics of Zionism and coping with loss. And in 2018, she was awarded the Israel Prize for Lifetime Achievement. Still, with Peretz being an outsider to politics with conservative and more nationalist ideologies, Herzog was largely assumed to win from the get-go. Netanyahu later thanking Peretz for her honorable candidacy, adding that he's certain Peretz will continue to contribute to Israeli society as she has done all her life.
Now moving on, an emboldened Iran, seen by many as one of the greatest threats to Israel, continuing its aggressive rhetoric and actions. Iran's Quds Force commander Brigadier General Ismail Ghani made remarks over the weekend calling on Israelis to go back to Europe and America, saying that the Palestinians were ready to take back control of the occupied lands.
توصیه میکنیم به همه صهیونیست ها قبل از اونی که خانه هایی که در اروپا و امریکا و جاهای دیگه فروختین و اومدین توی سرزمین گرانتر از امروز بشود برگردین و خونه هاتون رو بخرین و بازسازی کنین.
The Quds Force commander also praised Hamas for the recent conflict, seemingly boasting of their improved capabilities since the previous rounds of fighting.
در این جنگ اثبات شد که فلسطین قهرمان انشاءالله باید در فکر اداره کل فلسطین باشد و رژیم صهیونیستی باید از الان به فکر ترک کردن این سرزمین باشد.
These remarks were made after last week Director General of the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, confirmed that the Islamic Ayatollah regime is enriching uranium to levels of 60% purity and higher, or in other words, to nearly weapons-grade uranium, and expressing severe reservations about the ability to return to the nuclear deal. While the May 21st Egyptian brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is holding, major efforts are underway to secure a long-term ceasefire agreement. As such, Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi arrived in Egypt on Sunday, invited by his Egyptian counterpart to discuss the ceasefire as well as bilateral ties between the two countries. This is a significant invitation as it marks the first high-level public visit to Egypt by an Israeli official in over a decade. Yet, despite the recent calm, the backlash from the latest round of fighting continues, as the United Nations Human Rights Council voted on Thursday to launch an international investigation into crimes committed during the 11-day conflict. ILTV's Hannah Rifkin with the report.
By a vote of 24 states in favor, 9 against, and 14 abstentions, the UN Human Rights Council adopting a resolution on Thursday, presented by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Palestinian delegation to the United Nations, to launch an investigation into crimes committed during the recent conflict between Israel and terrorist group Hamas in Gaza. The resolution seeks to launch an investigation into alleged war crimes of the 11-day conflict, though has no end date for the investigation.
As to the resolution before us, Germany holds strong reservations. The Human Rights Council has an important role dealing with acute crisis and related human rights violations. The present resolution, however, does not address the recent escalation and omits any context. Instead, it would mandate a commission of inquiry that stretches indefinitely into the future and the past.
Ahead of the vote, permanent representative of Israel to the UN in Geneva, Ambassador Meirav Elon Shachar, called on the member states to condemn Hamas and ask them what they would do if rockets were launched on their cities.
Each one of these rockets constitutes a war crime. Each one of these rockets constitutes a tragedy. I want to ask member states participating in today's session, what would you do if rockets were fired at Dublin, Paris, or Madrid? How would you respond if terrorists attacked Beijing, Islamabad, or Moscow?
As such, the Hamas terrorist organization welcomed the resolution, while Israel was quick to reject it, saying the country would not cooperate with the probe.
The resolution does not mention Hamas, does not mention the more than 4,400 rockets that were launched at Israeli civilians indiscriminately. Judging from past experience, the Commission of Inquiry will not look into Hamas war crimes. Therefore, Israel will not cooperate with such an investigation. We are committed to the security of our citizens and will continue to protect our population while upholding our obligations under international law.
In other news, Israeli and Egyptian officials finalizing the details of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Hannah Rifkin reporting with the details.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sitting down in Jerusalem opposite Egyptian intelligence chief Abbas Kamel on Sunday, The two discussing strengthening cooperation between Israel and Egypt, as well as finalizing details of the ceasefire just established between Israel and the Hamas terror group in Gaza. Additionally, Kamel and his delegation slated to head to both Ramallah and Gaza to speak with PA President Abbas and Hamas leaders before the end of their trip. And Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, meanwhile in Cairo, speaking with his counterpart Sameh Shoukry, largely to discuss the same issues. But Egypt, having played a major role in mediating the Israel-Hamas conflict, has a lot of work ahead. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Foreign Minister Ashkenazi putting forward two conditions for allowing high-level reconstruction aid to flow into Gaza. First, that a system for keeping the aid in civilian hands as opposed to those of Hamas terrorists be put in place. And second, that the two civilians and remains of two soldiers held in Gaza for nearly 7 years be returned. Soldiers Oron Shaul and Hadar Golden were killed in 2014 during the war with Hamas. Hamas has been holding their bodies ever since. And civilian Israelis Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed are thought to have walked into Gaza on their own in 2015, before likewise being imprisoned by Hamas terrorists. Both the Mengistu and al-Sayed families saying their sons suffer from mental illness.
Now, speaking of the conflict, ceasefire or no ceasefire, the threat from Gaza against southern Israeli towns is ongoing. A Palestinian man armed with a knife stabbing an Israeli security guard Sunday night after infiltrating Israel from Gaza. And Israeli authorities are suspecting the attack of being a terrorist attack. The assailant was first identified as suspicious when walking alone by the road near the Israeli Sde Avraham community just north of the Gaza and Egyptian borders. When community security officers approached the man, he took out a knife and stabbed one of them. The other officer at the scene then responding by shooting the suspect, who later died of his wounds. The unarmed Israeli guard, who was stabbed, on the other hand, recovering in hospital. And a full investigation into how the suspect crossed so far into Israel in the first place already underway. Now, Israel reportedly destroying a forward Syrian outpost in northern Israeli territory overnight, the latest in a rare admission of Israeli actions against Syrian assets. The Israeli army, quote, vaporizing a Syrian regime observation post late Tuesday night on the Israeli side of the Alpha Line, a UN-patrolled buffer zone established in 1974. No injuries have been reported. And releasing the footage Wednesday morning, IDF spokesperson Avichai Adri tweeting that Israel would not tolerate any attempt to violate its sovereignty, especially as this is apparently the third mission of this kind in the last year. Outposts like these reportedly used by both Iran proxy fighters from the Lebanese Hezbollah and other pro-Iranian militants. Additionally, speaking with Hebrew media, the IDF saying it chose to use ground forces in this post's demolition rather than the typical airstrikes just to send a message. A message, it seems, is ultimately intended for Iran. The operation coincidentally coming just hours after the official confirmation of David Barnea as the new director of the Mossad, Israel's premier foreign intelligence outfit. And Prime Minister Netanyahu outlining the Mossad's continuing mission at Barnea's swearing-in ceremony.
האיום הגדול ביותר זה האיום הקיומי שמוצב על ידי הניסיונות של איראן להתחמש בנשק גרעיני, בין אם לאיים עלינו ישירות בהשמדה של מדינה קטנה ומרוכזת בנשק אטומי, או בין אם לאיים עלינו במאות אלפי טילים או רבבות טילים שמגובות במטריה גרעינית. זה איום שמאיים על המשך המפעל הציוני. ועלינו להילחם באיום הזה, ללא סוף. כי איראן שונה מיתר המדינות שמחזיקות היום בגרעין. ולכן הכלה זה לא, הכלה, מה שקוראים, containment, זה לא אופציה.
Barnea beginning his 5.5-year term following Yossi Cohen, who is largely credited for his role in establishing the Abraham Peace Accords and countless missions to slow Tehran's nuclear breakout, including the January 2018 raid of Iran's secret nuclear archives. Cohen was even awarded the Prime Minister's Prize for Mossad operations just last week, thanks to Cohen's daring, imaginative, and crazy operations, successfully carried out by the agency.
אני אומר לכם, ג'יימס בונד פרייר לעומתכם. אני יודע שאנחנו הולכים לפתוח את בתי הקולנוע בעוד כמה ימים. אין שם סרט אחד, סרט פעולה אחד, שמשתווה למה שהמוסד עושה.
Speaking of Iran-backed proxy groups now, Lebanese and Arabic media sources reporting some very serious news. Though still speculative, the reports are alleging that Hezbollah terror chief Hassan Nasrallah has died Monday night of coronavirus. The speculations beginning last week with rumors of Nasrallah's hospitalization during a virtual media blackout, and Nasrallah's emerging from the blackout to give a speech against Israel, actually only reinforcing the rumors of his illness. The Lebanese terror leader looking pale while coughing and occasionally struggling for breath throughout the whole address. And finally now, rumors continuing with Nasrallah's apparent demise. But again, all that said, this is far from the first time Nasrallah has been rumored to have died, and no official reports have been released. Additionally, Lebanese paper Al-Jumhuriyah claiming that Nasrallah simply recovering from a bout with allergies and pneumonia. Now, coronavirus restrictions in Israel are lifted, and citizens around the country are celebrating their newly rediscovered senses of freedom. But none are celebrating as much as Israeli healthcare professionals who've been on the front lines of the pandemic since day one. Hospital staff at Tel Aviv's Ichilov Hospital even receiving appreciation through a congratulatory serenade.
So I'm so happy to be here this morning as Israel is out from the corona. I think Israel is a great spot to live during the COVID-19 period. I'm so happy to play in front of all the doctors and the people who just won this COVID-19. So I would like to thank you, and I'm going to play a few songs. So it's a great morning to Israel and to the world.
We are stepping out of the corona. Corona is no longer an epidemic here in Israel. Can be a sporadic disease. People can get corona, but no epidemic. And we are returning to life 100% full.
Then to keep the momentum going, Israel expecting to open vaccinations for children aged 12 to 15 by next week. Approval for vaccinating kids assumed to be coming in the next few days. And this despite a new Israeli report linking Pfizer's second vaccine dose with heart issues. Israel's health ministry reporting 275 cases of myocarditis, or inflammation of the heart muscle, between December 2020 and May 2021, particularly in males under 30 years old, and typically after receiving the second dose. Several dozen cases occurred in people with pre-existing conditions, however, and nearly all cases were thankfully mild, with patients leaving the hospital within days. Only one death has been linked to myocarditis, but not conclusively, according to the report.
Now in other news, some good news. For the first time in over a year, the first group of foreign tourists arrived in Israel last week and has been touring the country. This as Israel has seen a drastic drop in coronavirus cases and as the country prepares to drop many coronavirus restrictions.
A group of 12 Christian pilgrims studying theology at the Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, became the first group of tourists to arrive in Israel in over a year. The group landing at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport on Thursday afternoon and greeted by Israeli Minister of Tourism, Orit Farkasha-Cohen.
After over a year, since March 2020, Israel has closed its skies to tourism. And today I was very excited to welcome the first group of vaccinated tourists to come to Israel after the COVID-19. Israel is COVID-19 free. It is world leading in the rate of its vaccination. Everything is open here, from restaurants to hotels to resorts to holy places and so on. And we have a lot to offer.
The group, being led by Pastor Tom Zelt of the Prince of Peace Church, is planning to visit Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Christian sites around the country.
It's wonderful to be back in Israel, in the land in which God has done so much for us. It's great to have students here to be able to study and to tour, to see these wonderful places. So we're glad it opened up. Thanks for working so hard to be so safe for us, and we're very grateful to be here.
Israel closed its borders to foreign tourists when the coronavirus pandemic began in March 2020. And now, since the majority of the country's population is vaccinated and the coronavirus cases have drastically dropped, the government launching a new pilot program allowing small groups of vaccinated tourists to enter the country. Under the pilot, the tourism ministry saying it expects around 20 groups to arrive, including from the United States, Germany, and the UK. Despite opening its borders, Israeli authorities still remain very wary of introducing new variants into the country. And as such, all tourists entering must show a negative corona test before flying and take another test upon arriving. The group also needs to take serological tests at their hotel to prove they have COVID-19 antibodies and are required to remain in quarantine until the results return, usually a matter of a few hours, before they're able to enjoy the sights here in Israel.
A 2,000-year-old basilica and Odeon theater now unveiled near Ashkelon. The exciting find being the latest in a series of discoveries at the site, soon to be adapted for visitors. And ILTV's Chana Rifkin has the details.
A magnificent find at Israel's Tel Ashkelon National Park, a 2,000-year-old Roman basilica complex, the largest of its kind in the country, complete with an Odeon, or theater, and massive marble features. And with the completion of the development, conservation, and restoration work, including the display of sculptures and columns found at the site will be open to the public for visitation. Now, the basilica, a central public Roman building, was built in 3 parts, a central hall and 2 side halls, floors and walls all made of hundreds of tons of marble, and the whole massive structure was then covered by a roof, surrounded with rows of huge marble columns and sculptures. Finally, originally founded by Herod the Great, the basilica went through multiple renovations and restructurings, all documented in the ruins, including a renovation in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, before its eventual destruction in the year 363 at the hands of an earthquake. In the years since its fall, the building was later abandoned, transformed into an industrial area with several installations atop it, and even partially broken up by the Ottomans so that the marble could be used as paving stones.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.